Welcome to the second webinar in the series that we're organizing at the Lincoln International Business School in our series around responsible management. This series of it's a series of 3 webinars we're organizing in preparation of the upcoming Master of Sustainable Business Administration, which will be launched in September, this September, the program, and in preparation of that of our new MBA program, we are organizing these 1-hour webinars. Just to give a little bit of flavor of what it's like, our new MSBA. At the end of this hour, we talk a little bit more about the MSBA, but it's now 3 o'clock UK time, so I suggest we just get started. If more people are joining, they can just be admitted to the session. And so in the next hour, Andy and I will talk a little bit about the current COVID crisis and unsustainable management. We are very glad that you are here with us. What we are going to do first is introduce ourselves a little bit. Next, I will talk about for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then Andy will also talk about 10 to 15 minutes on this topic of the current crisis and unsustainable management or sustainable management. And then the remainder of this hour we have our discussion. So feel free to put your questions into the chat, or when we have finished our talks, please feel free, of course, to join the conversation. But let's just first briefly introduce ourselves. Andy and I are program leaders for the upcoming MSBA, which is an MBA program, but with an S for sustainability. And it's a radically designed program for experienced workers and managers just so like an MBA, but entirely different. And this program is the result of conversations that we have had over the last 5 years within the business school, with colleagues, with people from other departments in the university and from other universities, around the basic question of, okay, what do we need to do as business school? My name is Matthijs. I'm a professor of responsible management, and I've been at Lincoln for 5 years now, and I've been doing research, and I have been active around the field of responsible management. And Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I think one of the important words that Matthijs used there was the word conversation, and we see today as part of the conversation that we're having, not just between me and Matthijs over a coffee when we could meet up for a coffee, but with colleagues in the business school and more broadly with colleagues in organisations and beyond the business school. So we're really pleased to start extending this conversation. As Matthijs said, it's part of a broader project that we've been working on and developing in terms of thinking what responsibility means, what responsible management means, and how can we do something effective to address some of these challenges that we're currently facing in the world. And our approach to tackling the problem, both in our teaching and our research, has been about this idea of dialogue. So a conversation, a dialogue, a sharing of ideas, and based on this critical approach as well, questioning the assumptions around the way we do things now. So that's the basis of what we're doing, and it gives you a bit of a flavour of what we're doing on the new programme that we're launching in September. So I'll hand back to Matthijs and chat to you later.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So the first webinar we organized last month was around why sustainability has failed. And today what we are going to do is, sorry, that was, there we are. The computer interfering with the presentation. Today we are extending the conversation, and of course not everybody amongst you had also participated in the last webinar, but of course they are self-standing. And today we are talking about COVID, the current COVID crisis, and unsustainable management. And so as you are probably aware, there's a lot of talk about sustainable management, but today we want to talk particularly about insustainability or unsustainable management. And the necessary question that we have to ask, and which basically is also one of the main leading questions for our new program, is the one on the left here, and which is about whether COVID-19 is the current pandemic is the crisis that will spur radical change. So if we look at the major global issues that we are facing in a contemporary world, such as climate change, inequalities, racism, populism, and so on, we have come to an awareness now that it is no longer sufficient just to rely upon small steps and hoping that that will cause sufficient change in society and to our world. But we become, as we said, we have now become aware that we need much more radical change in society. And so for us as business school, the question is, okay, what can we do as business school in order to facilitate the more radical change that is needed to effectively combat all of these enormous global challenges that we are facing. And so, for instance, today the Guardian headline was that that in this current crisis year 2021, the global emissions will never have been so high as in this year. So if we are thinking about what is happening in the contemporary in the current crisis and in our contemporary world, we are still facing these enormous problems. And if we talk about sustainability, and for instance, and then of course focusing primarily on climate change, we are far from resolving this enormous problem. And in contrast, we have never emitted so many emissions, and we have never polluted our world in any history of humanity. So what we actually are observing in this crisis, because I presume that many of you, just like us, have heard and read and talked about so much around the COVID crisis over the last year. So the question is, okay, what sensible is there still to argue or to say about the current crisis? But still we are in the process of making sense of, okay, what is now happening and how is the crisis now evolving. And so many of these topics, such as climate change and inequalities and so on, were already problematic before the crisis. But what the crisis actually shows now is that on the one hand, these global problems have manifested more but have come more to the surface, and beyond that have also been accentuated during the pandemic. So, for instance, when we have, and this was of course news from last year, when it was found out that that the Black communities in our Western societies are much more vulnerable to dying of the corona crisis, we observed how existing inequalities are again even amplified during the crisis. And now the question is, for us now, a year after the crisis, and for instance, if we look at the UK, where which is one of the countries with the highest rates of vaccination, now we are in a phase where we're entering the question around what about the post-pandemic life, and if there is something like that, if there will be a kind of a life beyond COVID, or whether we have to deal with a life where such diseases such as COVID are just part of our everyday society, and we have to learn to live with it. But if we look at how the crisis have developed so far, what we see is that we can at least identify 3 stages. So, in the first stage of the COVID crisis, what we see is this process of collective solidarity. So where society was entering lockdown, where there was a lot of support, of course, for the lockdowns, where we were clapping for healthcare, and this was happening across many countries. So there was really a moment of collective solidarity where we felt as society as being one. We were all in the same boat. But then, this phase didn't last that long, because after it, we entered a much more individualistic stage where we saw the emergence of COVID protests. So people protesting the lockdowns and the restrictions of freedom, and being angry that they were forced to be stuck in lockdown, while certainly they were not themselves necessarily at risk of dying from the coronavirus. And now what we are entering in the last months or so is a kind of a 3rd stage, where we see the emergence of this dual society. And this dual society is perhaps interesting to take a closer look at, particularly in the context of the topic of today, COVID and sustainable or unsustainable management. And that is the emergence of this dual society, not necessarily within countries per se, but sometimes also beyond borders, so countries versus other countries. So what we are entering is this idea of a dual society, where we see a rapid normalization of this idea. So on the one hand, within many countries, there is a pressure for normalization, so an opening up of normal life, the resuming of all the things that we were used to before the crisis, so the opening of the restaurants and the pubs and so on, and there is a pressure on it. But at the same time, in many countries, there's still very much this other society, which is for instance the full hospitals, the people who are suffering from long COVID effects, and so on. And so so this process of normalization is something that we are constantly observing. So this constant pressure on individuals and people to make sense of what is happening, and how this has perhaps led to the emergence of some kind of dual society. So on the one hand, we have seen and witnessed a lot of effects in terms of politics. So, for instance, the the rapid transition of many Western and globally perhaps governments to become much more socialist. So in the sense that whole economies needed to be supported by the state, people's incomes needed to be supported by the state. But at the same time, what we also observed is a very quick rebounding of the economy. So if we look at now the stock markets today, the fossil fuel industry, but also intensive farming in many Western countries, that they have rebounded much more quickly than individuals have. So, for instance. It is not without some irony that we can observe that for instance the stock markets have bounced back much quicker than individuals have. So the stock markets have never been higher. So they have shown to be much more adaptable to the crisis than individuals and societies are. And so, of course, this also links to the continuance of many of the industries, and so many of the multinational companies and their businesses throughout the crisis. And so politically, what we have seen is that there is some kind of nationalism where countries are focusing very much on getting their own populations vaccinated. In terms of workplaces, there's also this kind of distinction being made now, which happened quite early on in the crisis, where there was where we started to distinguish between jobs that are really necessary and the more bullshit jobs. So the crucial jobs in healthcare, education, and so on, which are really meaningful, but then you also have another layer of jobs which are not really needed, and added with a more social, psychological level, what we've seen is that we also had to psychologically cope with a lot of changes over the last year. So very practically, the end of the handshake, so the introduction of the face mask in public life, and the introduction of social distancing. So we had to find new ways of relating to each other. And so this is all indicative of a process where we have to adapt to new realities. And finally, in terms of environment, what we have seen is perhaps with almost some nostalgic sadness, we can look back on the first weeks and months of the crisis in 2020, where for a moment we saw the dolphins swimming in the Venice canals and so on. So for a moment there was quite some news, and it already sounds quite long ago now. But this moment where we realized that the pandemic could achieve what no politician or political organization would ever achieve, and that was the necessary stopping of the world economy. But of course, not long after that, returning also to the stock markets, the need for the economy to bounce back and to grow again was prioritizing any environmental concern there. So we are constantly now for the last year confronted in many ways with this concept perhaps of the dual society. So constantly we are faced with the changing contours of society. So the idea that on the one hand societies are opening up, but on the other hand, there's also lockdown. So on the one hand, there's people who start to enjoy public life again and try to resume their old life from the pre-pandemic, but at the same time, the hospitals are still full. And the hospitals are still struggling outside the UK with the corona crisis. And so this this constant kind of separation between two different societies in our society. So on the one hand, those who are privileged enough to work from home, to do their work behind the computers, versus those people who are being exposed to the crisis, to the virus, because they have to work on the front line. And in the same vein, what we see is that the crisis was also a moment when people could actually take a moment of or time for reflection upon, okay, what is it actually that we're doing, and is there a possibility for a reflection on our current economy, how we organize, how we live our lives, and so on. But of course, this reflection was not possible for everyone who was, for instance, working in healthcare, where there is still a major crisis in terms of trying to deal with the COVID patients, and so on and so on. So this dual society, of course, is nothing new. We have always seen this, and for instance, if we think back of this. Of the movie The Matrix, this movie, this also popular movie, of course, the idea behind it is that there is a kind of a society that we observe, and then a much more hidden society which actually is structuring the world that we see around us, and so. So this idea of dual society has always been, or has for a long time has existed, but and it's for us as academics, we look upon it, of course, from a perspective of trying to understand what is happening in our contemporary world and contemporary economy, but at the same time, it is also moving towards more conspiracy theories. Which the conspiracy theory, the basic element of a conspiracy theory is almost always that there is this kind of observed reality that we can see all around us, but behind that is something else. For instance, an elite that secretly rules the world. And of course, the flaw of a conspiracy theory is not the acknowledgement that there is the kind of a dual society. But the flow of a conspiracy theory is that they presume that this is always kind of a secret society that we cannot observe. But at the same time, what is actually happening, just like in so many countries nowadays, where we have this kind of the process of trying to open up and live a normal life versus the kind of the actual more traumatic experience of the current crisis, which is now unfolding in hospitals, for instance, which are full with dying people, or sometimes even countries like Brazil, where we can see that there is a whole society like Brazil, which is one of the largest countries in the world, of course, and suffering majorly from the crisis, shows that actually that it is not hidden at all. It is right in front of there, but we have to see where it is actually. And so this idea of that we now have to get used more and more to this idea of trying to make sense and trying to deal in our heads constantly with the emergence and existence of multiple realities, of dual societies, where we are not necessarily part of, but where we still have to relate to. So in terms of our own positioning, and this is something that we also see in the debates around how workplaces and how organizations need to be moving on from the COVID crisis. So whether there is a chance for sustainable management, or actually a chance for, or whether we are in danger of this kind of perpetuation of unsustainable management. And Andy will talk more about that now. So do you want to share your own slides, Andy?
Yeah, if you stop sharing, I can share mine. Great, thank you. Okay, thanks, Matthijs. Just picking up really from where Matthijs has got to on that conversation, really starting to ask, what can we learn from the pandemic, or really what should we be learning from the pandemic? There's plenty of conversation and question and almost we might call them empty phrases really about what post-COVID means, the new normal, building back better, all quite worthy phrases, but they do feel quite empty at the moment. And if we do look back in terms of our recent history and the last one of the global crises that we faced, in some ways nothing really fundamentally changed. Although the world's economy nearly crashed in total and the banks were saved at the last moment, actually relatively little had changed after that in terms of underlying change. And it could quite well be argued that we're still suffering in some ways from that crash, and a number of the measures, austerity measures put in place to deal with that, have probably exacerbated the effects of the current pandemic as well. And really what happened, although again there was a lot of talk after the crash about a new normal and doing something different, actually really the fundamental systemic flaws in the way society operates and the real underlying causes that led to the crash, particularly an over-reliance on a finance sector, a highly risky finance sector that really overly exploited the poorer in society. A number of those things were really not tackled at all. We're still in the middle of in the UK, a major housing crisis in terms of providing affordable housing. So very few systematic lessons were learned. And really the idea that the way we were organising society was really unsustainable. Actually, to carry on managing society, organising society in the same way would still only give rise to further inequality, further poverty, and actually generation of wealth at a greater cost to human beings. And we've really not moved on from there. And in some ways, the absurdity of some of that is that this idea of driving towards continued and unlimited economic growth is still the underlying belief and assumption that drove the financial crash, and in some ways is driving the way that governments and organisations are exploring beyond the pandemic. It's all about returning to growth and resuming business as usual. And GDP still is that central important metric that is used to govern how well governments are performing and how well society performs, and irrespective of the human cost. So as Matthijs said, even in the pandemic, whereas the human cost has been very high, actually the wealth of a number of across a number of organisations, individuals, has gone up in the pandemic. So there's a absurdity really about this idea of growth, which has become decoupled from human well-being. So what are the lessons we perhaps should learn? What can we learn from the pandemic? What has it shown us that actually might give us an indication of what we could be doing differently? But I think one of these major lessons is that we can't separate health, nature, and the economy. They don't exist independently. In some ways, it's been an illusion that the economy is independent of society, or its only relation to the environment is how fast it can take resources out of the environment. So it's an absurdity. And really the pandemic has shown us that as soon as we haven't got available healthy workers to work in organisations, actually the economy in many sectors starts to grind to a halt. So it's a strong lesson that there is a link between, particularly between health and the economy. But we see that more broadly as well in terms of other ongoing health crises, mental health crisis, obesity, drug dependency. All of those health crises have an ongoing effect on the economy as well. And it's in some ways absurd. It's become normalized in a way to treat health and the economy as equal. And governments have taken different approaches to the pandemic, but many of them have tried to balance or play off health and the economy. But really that is absurd. And it's a philosophical point really, or a fundamental belief. Is wealth creation a means to an end, or is it an end in itself? Is the economy there to create a healthy world, or is the world there to create wealth? So it's something that we do need to revisit that and think, is it sustainable to carry on this focus on wealth creation at the expense of health of our planet? And in some ways, we see that absurdity in simply the way we value people's jobs. Matthijs spoke about work, but something like the average job in the finance sector pays at least 3 times more than the average job in health. So that gives us an idea of how we value it. We don't even treat them equally. We actually value finance much more than health. And maybe it needs a fundamental rethink that health is a fundamental human right. It's not something that's something we can do once the economy is working, we can then look at health. Actually, it should be front and centre of what a government is responsible for, of what we as citizens are responsible for. And again, building on this absurdity of the things that have become normalised, that aren't even good for us, is that we're destroying the planet and our environment that we're absolutely reliant on. This nested diagram shows that we exist within the environment and we only survive based on the environment, but we're still at an increasing rate destroying and damaging that environment and putting our long-term survival at risk, which seems so absurd, based really on short-term gain, which is driven by this need for growth and that very fixed economic model. There are some positive moves. The World Health Organization, which has been very front and center of trying to deal with and advise in the pandemic, has recently established a new council to start looking at economics and health in terms of shaping economics so it delivers planetary health for human beings and the environment. And that's positive, but there's a long way to go on that. But at least there's different questions being asked now. And the central part of that is it makes economic sense to invest in health, to invest more in health and health systems, because eventually that will make for a more resilient and sustainable economy. The other lesson to learn is how central this consumption-based approach is to our economy, and how really damaging that is, and how, again, the pandemic has revealed how our patterns of consumption, the way we generate wealth, are actually the causes of these crises, including the COVID pandemic. It's the way we actually produce, consume, and generate wealth are the causes of the pandemic. And that's what we need to think about to actually prevent or make ourselves more sustainable in the future. And for example, increasingly intensive meat production and rising meat consumption around the world does increase the likelihood that we will get more of these zoonotic diseases, this transfer of disease from animals to humans, and lead to more pandemics. Just because we've had a pandemic doesn't reduce the likelihood that we might have one again quite soon. We often say they're a 1 in 30 or 100-year event, but that the chances of them happening again aren't really shortened just because we've had one. And just because we've had the COVID pandemic doesn't mean we might have an even worse pandemic that's even more virulent and causes more death. So we do need to learn the lesson and change the way we organise our production, consumption and wealth distribution. And the other side to the way we, the logics that drive our consumption and market behaviour is that it's continually increasing inequality. And as Matthijs highlighted, these inequalities in society are a killer in themselves. Inequality and poverty is a killer, and it was seen as that in COVID as well. Huge disparities even in life expectancy in the UK due to poverty. Even in the same city that can occur. And we're still continually over-consuming our resources. And I didn't learn that from the first crisis, but we do need to learn that from the next one. And at a huge rate, 112 Empire State Buildings equivalent of resources consumed every day. So that's a huge amount. And the lifestyle of, if we extended the lifestyle of American consumers, and probably UK consumers as well, to the rest of the world, we'd need 5 Earths to provide enough resources to do that. So we're simply over-consuming, and we need to learn the lesson. So even though we're asking the right questions, if we look back to the last crisis, the likelihood is, and we're already seeing that powerful interests will cause a return to business as usual. Even though a lot of the discourse and conversation at the moment is a return, we don't want to go back to business as usual, the likelihood is that we will do. And we need to recognise really that there is still a battle for ideas. There are a number of different agendas, but 2 primary agendas. One that primarily values markets and individual freedom, rather than a more social outlook that looks to address social and environmental justice. And there's a battle for ideas there. And that needs to be to actually address these issues and become sustainable and responsible. That view that puts more value on social and environmental justice needs to take more force and win the battle more. But this neoliberal project, this reliance on markets, is very powerful. It's very well embedded in society. It is a project. It was founded deliberately around about 1947 by Friedrich Hayek. It's very well organized, very well funded. Think tanks, lobby groups, big businesses, intellectuals, historians. So this dominant view, which probably dominates society and shapes the policies of government still, actually shaping our behaviour. Unless we can start to shift that thinking, actually we will return to business as usual. And it shows how deeply embedded it is that business has become seen almost independent of society. Even in the news this week, this creation of this European Super League, almost independent of the fans and the communities of the clubs. And in the UK, Margaret Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society. And she carried Friedrich Hayek's book around in her handbag. So it's at the centre of many governments. And this idea that our problems can be solved through markets and technology is still very deeply embedded. So just to draw it to a close, we do need to address it. We do need to take in large-scale change. It feels sometimes pointless at an individual level, but we've seen how we can make rapid change. And we do really need to genuinely reorientate to this genuinely responsible management that fulfills a real duty of care to others, not just our legal duties, but our ethical duties as well. And we need to bridge a gap really between what needs doing at a large scale and what we need to do in organisations. We almost need to rebuild brick by brick, policy by policy, what sustainable HR looks like, what sustainable accountancy looks like, and what our different sectors look like. We need to rebuild them sustainably. And we need to make sure that we slowly transform society, but we do that in a way that generates and frees up the power of us more broadly. So we feel we can make a difference in our organisations and in society. So I'll draw that to a close. I'll take that slide back, actually. So I think we'll, thank you for listening to me and Matthijs. Now, we did want to open up for some questions now. I think I'll stop sharing my screen just for the moment. Just open that up to any questions that anybody might have. And thanks for listening to us share some of our ideas.
Yeah, Sarah. Come in, Sarah.
Can you unmute, Sarah?
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself first. Oh, okay. No, Sarah has put in a thank you for the presentation in the chat. Yeah. Any other questions? But otherwise, but please join the conversation. Okay, then in the meantime, Andy, thank you for your presentation, and you convincingly, in that sense, made the argument that our practices, societal practices, certainly are no longer sustainable in the sense, and we know that, right? We know, if we look around us, and we can see the destructive effects of so many of our practices, and if we look at the practices of many multinational companies and governments, pretty much tied up still in neoliberal ideologies and so on, free market thinking, no protection for the environment, no kind of embedding of protection of the environment, of the planet in our core structures and core framework. So what would you what would you suggest then as the kind of the first step of an individual's citizen in our society?
I think that's the challenge that we face in some ways, that for many people, they recognise that the need to make some changes, and in the abstract it makes sense that we want to become more sustainable and responsible. The challenge then becomes, and it's more of a complex question, what do we do in our own organisations? What do I do as an individual? And in some ways, we're, as well as seeking to have a conversation within organisations and sectors more broadly, this is a conversation that we're having within the university. So the question is, what does it mean for a university or a business school to be responsible? And that's not a straightforward question, it's complex. Our practice is quite complex. And in some ways, the unsustainability or the irresponsibility isn't on the surface, it's quite deeply hidden in some ways, and we have to go and find it. And so I think the first steps in some ways are asking some of those reflective questions and really reflecting on our own practice to discover where the unsustainability is. And it's the same journey that universities having on decolonialisation to address issues of inequality in society in terms of race and gender. Those things are almost hidden within our practice, and it's about surfacing those things in different sectors as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. If there's anybody who wants to join the conversation, just raise your hands or just unmute yourself. And in the meantime, can I ask you another question? Because I was on the one hand touched, but on the other hand also somewhat sad when I noticed my 6-year-old son talking about how we should put plastics in the right lid, in the right bin, and so on, and then at the same time, we also know that separating our plastics from our other waste doesn't really matter, because the price of virgin plastic, they call it, is always still lower than the cost of recycling plastic. So for companies, there's no incentive whatsoever to recycle plastics, and so they rather put it in the empty containers going to China and or Indonesia and dump it there. So, and then they go back, of course, with the full containers with all the products that we buy then. So these empty containers going to China and so on now also have something that they are filled with. But so the point here, of course, I think is how would you reflect upon this idea that we are now implementing in society, in our citizens, or even in the young children, that our duty is to recycle our waste, but at the same time, if we look into it, we also know that it doesn't matter because it's not recycled anyway.
I think that reveals this problem that we've got this gap in a way between what's happening at governmental and broad legislation changes, that we're almost waiting for governments to do something, waiting for the next climate change conference in Glasgow as if something's going to happen that'll be a game changer. But we even know from big events like the Paris Climate Accord that they're good intentions, but until they start being practiced in our daily practice as organisations particularly, it won't make a substantial difference. So I think it's both in a way. I think the individual is important, but in some ways that has to be coupled with more radical change at an organisational level as well. So all three levels are of course linked. They're not separate levels. And as individuals, we've also got a responsibility. In some ways, the government is us as well. So in terms of us being empowered to promote and demand change at a governmental level as well, is another way we can respond as individual citizens. And in some ways, those individual actions are important, but there's a danger that they just provide a psychological stroke in some ways to feel as if we're doing something. And in some ways, that's been part of the absurdity that we've been led to that.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a hand up there from Shajara.
Yes, Shajara, come in.
Can you unmute Shajara?
I'm sorry. I was talking and I didn't know that I didn't unmute myself. I was willing to thank you for such a nice discussion. It was really informative. And I agree. But the thing is that the actions in developed countries are usually different from the actions that need to be taken in underdeveloped countries. So what happens that at that time, the individual actions matter more if we are going to look into the sustainable approaches in underdeveloped countries, because no matter how much effort governments are putting and the organizations are trying to put, if the individuals don't understand that they are contributing negatively towards climate action and taking sustainable approaches, they usually the reaction to the government policies usually fails, no matter whatever do. For example, if you look into the situation in Pakistan, the situation related to plastic and garbage in the biggest city of Karachi, the government tried so many times at national and even at international level by taking support from other countries to resolve that issue. But as individuals don't understand that it's their individual responsibility towards climate, that they need to improve their actions, the government approaches failed. So that's why, as a result, the situation of the country is at number 135 or number 136 in terms of vulnerable approaches and the condition. So I think that in developed countries, we can say that, oh, okay, governments are taking action and people are responding to that. So overall, the organizational development is helping in improving the sustainable approaches. But when it comes to the underdeveloped countries, the need of making people aware of the importance of their individual action is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Yeah. And there's in the beginning of this and I think it is in that sense it's important to distinguish between countries as well, in terms of how much awareness there generally is of the need to transition to a much more sustainable society and sustainable economy, and there's many countries indeed where there is much less public awareness of the need for the actual transformation towards or the necessity of the transformation. And it is here also because Andy talked and mentioned a couple of times these absurdities, and I think this is also another case of absurdity, because if we look at Pakistan as well, I think because Pakistan is also one of the countries which is also suffering from climate change with the droughts each year, and the heat, of course. And so Pakistan is one of those countries, isn't it, which is also dealing more and more with the rising temperatures and droughts and so on. So at the same time, they're also suffering, and of course, I think in a bigger picture, we cannot escape the contexts here as well. So the decades, the context of decades of colonialism and neo-colonial practices as well, in terms of how climate change is also the effect of an economic model, so to say, which is prioritizing economic growth, and so the exploitation of our resources, planetary resources, environmental, human resources, and so on, that we have in our world. But this, I think it's also important indeed in many countries to first start with the raising awareness of the problem. And there's also, for instance, in the Netherlands, where I come from, you have the Party for the Animals, which is one of the parties that is really a political party, which is which is striving towards a much more sustainable economy and so on. But at the same time, there is this lack in that party that it's primarily consisting of white people. So it's not diverse in terms of its membership base, and so that's one of the problems, I think, with climate change as well in countries, that it's inherently intertwined with a lot of other societal factors, such as inequalities. But yeah, go ahead, Sashara.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And in terms of increasing awareness, yes, so that's the reason why I had submitted the proposal for the research seed funding for Prime, and managed to get that. And that was the approach that I have taken, that if the academics are going to be trained, and then they will be able to deliver that through their own teaching, because the research says that there are all over the world only 17% of the academics are trying to use sustainable approaches and responsibly sustainable education approaches to teach their learners. So that's why I thought that it would be a good idea to take it to Pakistan, and where they can be trained, and then they can further develop that understanding to the people. If younger generation is aware, then obviously they will be the first one to make some change. So let's hope for some betterment to be seen in the society, because we can hope from the youngsters that they are those who will be able to make some positive changes.
Absolutely, yeah. And it sounds like a really relevant and very interesting project. Yeah, yes.
Yes, thank you.
It looks like we're starting to get towards the end of time. I think, do you want me to just share the slide about the new program, Matthijs?
Yeah.
So just briefly, as we come to a close, just wanted to mention that the sort of conversation that we've been having today and the sort of questions we're exploring almost models a new program that we are launching in September, or starting in September, which actually got through its validation last week. So we're starting to plan and recruit in more detail for that now. But in some ways, this program is trying to answer and address and explore a number of the questions that we've explored today. So in some ways, we've been modelling that. And it's quite a radically different program, exploring a number of these issues, and an unconventional program in some ways that breaks out of conventional separate subject modules and takes a much more interdisciplinary approach, because we know that these problems are complex and don't have a solution that's based in a single subject of economics, management, philosophy, marketing, psychology. It's complex and multifaceted. So that's why I've deliberately designed the program that way. It's a 2-year program, and it's taught in a block teaching approach with a very intensive 2-day conference style approach. So we're very much looking forward to that, and almost extending these types of conversations further as we move forward. I've clicked onto the next slide there, but so we'll be putting out more information on that. But if very happy for you to contact myself or Matthijs if you wanted more information and details on that program.
Yeah.
As we said earlier, this is actually part of a series of webinars. So we've got another one coming up soon. And hopefully you might be able to join that one as well. So 20th of May, we're looking at probably doing the next stage, really, imagining what difference could look like. What might a truly sustainable workplace look like? And again, we're trying to mirror the sort of things we're trying to look at in our programme coming up later this year. I think we probably will draw to a close. Thanks very much for your attending today. Thanks very much for the questions and the conversations we were able to have there. And on behalf of Matthijs and myself, thanks very much for the opportunity. There will be again a video of this that we'll post on YouTube as well, and we'll provide a link to that as well. So that do stay engaged with the conversation. We're very happy to do that. It helps us develop the project and enriches the project. So I think I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.